Thanks. All right. It'll build up. Thanks. Okay. I want to talk today about Federalist 10. Sort of did it work. We'll review a little bit Federalist 10. We'll think about some alternate scenarios about if the Constitution hadn't passed. And we'll talk about banks because, well, I'm obsessed with banks. And I think banks are an answer to, the Bank of the United States is one of the answers to Josh Barron's question on PACBAC. I've been following you guys on PACBAC. You've been doing, have such great questions. Sorry. Is there a movie, a SpongeBob movie? Josh Barron had a question of how did the U.S. afford to fight this war? And the answer is the U.S. Gets a whole lot of debts. It sort of starts to, we talked about the financial revolution in Britain. There's a similar financial revolution in the United States. So I want to talk a little bit about how that happens and the sort of pros and cons of that. So, right. And Twitch stat says 95. So it's like, what, a couple of minutes behind you guys. So let's just review faction in Federalist 10. We talked about Federalist 10 last time. So what is the takeaway from Madison? He's the one there on the right, writing as Publius in Federalist number 10. And what's the problem with a republic? What are the dangers to a republic? How is a republic potentially in danger? Who threatens a republic? Okay, tyranny of the majority, possibly, right? So that's one of the tyrannies. So tyranny is one of the problems, and it could be tyranny of the majority. Excellent. So the majority could, for example, abolish debt and leave poor, rich people without any money. Okay, there's a need for separation of powers. We now know who it was, but no one at the time knew what it was. Corruption. Okay, excellent. So corruption and tyranny of the majority are the two big problems that we're dealing with. But as Madison and Jay and Hamilton saw it, when they're writing as Publius, they're a little bit worried that this sort of revolution has gotten a little out of control and people are going to maybe hang them for supporting a constitution. Lack of virtue. Okay. Right. So the fear is that virtue is going to decline. And so the answer to that, the danger of the lack of virtue, which is either the tyranny of the majority or corruption, how does Federalist 10 fix that? How does the Constitution fix that? How does the Constitution prevent those three problems: lack of virtue, corruption, and tyranny of the majority? As Anna said, it's separation of, bicameral legislature, separation of powers, checks and balances. Okay, and what else? What about the scope of the institution? All right, electoral college also to separate people and refine people's ideas so that that virtue will kind of out the higher, maybe the further you are away from the regular people. The bigger the state, the less corruption, as Sasha says. Right. So the idea is that a big state somehow, in Federalist 10 anyways, the claim is that a bigger state will prevent corruption because one corrupt group will be warring against another corrupt group, and then they'll sort of check each other in a way. And what we're going to see is that this tension between groups, each accusing the other of corruption, is going to be the basis of our party system. Okay, so let's. But I want to. So I want to talk about that party system. I want to talk about the Bank of the United States and its connection to that. But let me just say a couple of things first about the effects of the revolution that I hadn't really discussed earlier. Now, slavery ends in most of the northern states, and to a certain extent, that's because of black soldiers who fought for the Union in Connecticut and Massachusetts and elsewhere. But it's also after the war enslaved men and women. The examples are Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker in Massachusetts, but there are lots of other enslaved people who do this as well, successfully sue for their freedom in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And so one of the things that happens as a result of this revolution is that some enslaved people in New England in particular, are able to, and to a certain extent in New York, are able to win their freedom by pointing to the state constitutions, which say the state constitutions say all men are created equal, right? All men are created equal. This comes from the Declaration of Independence, but it's also in the state constitutions. If all men are created equal, then there ought not to be slavery. So slavery does end in some of those states. Another thing that's important for a long-term country is state of the country is that Virginia Baptists in particular, those are people in the western part of the state. People in the eastern part of the state tend to be Anglican, at least the elite are. People in the western part of the state tend to be Baptists or Methodists. And the Baptists in particular resent having to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church. Under the old Virginia colonial system, you paid a tax, and that tax supported the church. It actually supported not just the church, but also the College of William and Mary, which was supposed to be educating Anglican bishops. And their case against supporting the Anglican Church, they say, well, you know, the Anglican Church is too much like the Catholic Church. There ought to be liberty of conscience. We ought to be able to decide which churches we go to and which ones we support. And Madison and Jefferson, this is in part how they become political leaders, support these Western farmers, many of them who are non-slaveholders, in supporting the separation or the disestablishment of the churches, so that there won't be an official church of Virginia like there was an official church in colonial Massachusetts or colonial Connecticut. And so we see formal separation of church and state, which is a kind of result of this revolution as well. Is that clear? And then what we see is the parts of the Iroquois Confederation under Joseph Brant leave for Canada. And others in the Iroquois Confederation move to permanent reservations in New York. There is opposition to them in part because they had been armed by the British, and Brant and others in the Iroquois Confederation believe that they'll be safer if they go to Canada. Formal separation of the church and state means there's no official state religion. So in Germany in this time, or in Britain, you see in Britain the official religion of the British state is the Church of England, and you pay a tax, and the tax supports the Church of England, and so what the formal separation of church and state says is the government will not support one particular religion over another. It's ironic or interesting that the people who want this separation of church and state are the Baptists, who believe that the Anglican Church is way too powerful in Britain. And so there's no formal support for this, and there's also that also means that there'll be no formal requirements. For example, you don't have to be an Anglican to be a political candidate in election. That's not true in Great Britain. In Great Britain, you can't go to the Oxford or Cambridge unless you're Anglican. You can't run for office if you're not Anglican in Britain. And basically, what happens initially in Virginia and then in the other states is that there's no requirement of a particular religion for public office, and the state doesn't support any particular church. So the Iroquois Confederation under Joseph Brant leaves for Canada, and others move to permanent reservations in New York. The Cherokees and the Creeks, who had also been supported by the British during the Revolution, or some of them, moved to reservations in West Georgia, right around where we are in Athens, and further west. But these reservations will not be permanent. Within a generation, they will be attacked by Georgia settlers as people try to move into that land. But the ones in New York state are actually still exist. And so there are some folks who have been in the Iroquois Confederation whose great-great-great-great-grandkids are still have registered in New York and still operate. Okay, so those are some of the effects of the revolution that aren't directly connected to this question of Federalist 10 or the bank, but I just wanted to make sure that they were clear to you guys. Okay, so it's Publius is one of the names of the people who supports, is the pen name for the people who support the Constitution. And this is John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, who are all on the same side. All of them support the Constitution. They are Federalists, right? And the writings of Publius are later called the Federalist Papers. But there's a series of articles, including Federalist number 10 that I just mentioned, that make the case for there being a constitution. Okay, that's the Federalist side. The Federalist side supports the Constitution. Against them, arrayed against them, are the Anti-Federalists. Now, this is not exactly a term that they chose, but this is a term that was sort of imposed on them by their opponents. The word Federalist is a little bit weird because Federalist, when you talk about a federal form of government, you're actually talking about a government with divided powers and where states have authority, not just the federal government. But in any event, the people who support the Constitution call themselves Federalists, and their opponents get branded as Anti-Federalists. This is so it is a little bit confusing, but yeah, the Federalists support a strong, in the U.S. context, the Federalists support a stronger central government. The Anti-Federalists don't. They either favor the Articles of Confederation, the old Articles of Confederation, or they want some more guarantees of liberty because they fear this strong central government. Okay, so these people write under pen names too, and they're Brutus, Federal Farmer, and Cato are some of the people who write under these names, and I've now forgotten who they are individually, but these are likewise people who write under pen names, and they argue against the Constitution. And it's the Anti-Federalists ultimately push the Anti-Federalists ultimately in making the case for the sort of liberties that ought to be defended, the people's liberties that ought to be defended. The response of the Federalists and the response of the other states is to say, well, we'll support the Constitution, but only if there's a Bill of Rights added. Only if the Anti-Federalists, who are scared of the strong central government, get their way and allow and demand certain freedoms that will be guaranteed in the Constitution to prevent an overly strong centralized government. Does that make sense? So the Anti-Federalists initially oppose the Constitution, but as a sort of olive branch from the Federalists, we see a Bill of Rights proposed in Virginia and then circulated, and then the Constitution is ratified with the Bill of Rights added. So there are enough Anti-Federalists that go along with this, that say, all right, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, no quartering of military forces, the government can't is limited in a variety of ways. You don't have to testify against yourself. All of these amendments, there are enough Anti-Federalists that sort of go along with the Constitution if there are these guaranteed liberties that people have against a potentially powerful federal government. Okay? So after the Constitution is adopted, the Anti-Federalists pretty much go away. That is, there are still people who are suspicious about a federal government, but there's no longer an anti-federalist movement, really, in the United States. There will be a party system that's going to come along, but it's not going to be federalists against anti-federalists. What it's actually going to be is that this coalition, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, is going to split somewhat later. And Madison is going to go off to form a separate group called the Democratic Republicans. John Jay and Alexander Hamilton are going to remain Federalists. And so we're going to end up by 1786, 1787 with, 1790, 1791 with two parties, the Federalists on the one hand and the Democratic Republicans on the other. How do we understand this? Where does this come from? Right? Although I'm going to argue that Hamilton gets too much credit in that show. That Hamilton this is a pretty that show is based on a book by a huge supporter of Alexander Hamilton. And what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of a sense of what the Democratic Republicans, why the Democratic Republicans oppose Hamilton. And this is the darker side, I think, of Alexander Hamilton that we'll be talking about today. Maybe we could call this lecture anti-Hamilton. Let me talk about that. The person that makes me most suspicious of Alexander Hamilton is this dude, William Duer. He's Colonel William Duer, and he is a military contractor and land speculator, and he is assistant to the Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. And while Hamilton himself is not directly involved in these maneuvers, William Duer becomes probably the nation's or the United States' first millionaire as Hamilton's assistant. How does he become a millionaire? He buys up state bonds at a discount. So the states, the individual states like Virginia and Massachusetts and Connecticut, to help pay for the war, had issued bonds. Very much like Britain did, right, to fight this war. So Virginia issued bonds, Massachusetts issued bonds, Rhode Island issued bonds, but they can't pay for the bonds after the war. Even though they're taxing their people, the bonds become very expensive and they can't pay them off. They quickly become almost valueless, in particular Virginia bonds, so that unlike the British bonds, which are more or less stable, they pay. A 1,000-pound bond will pay, 100 pounds. Let's see, 500-pound bond will pay 10 pounds every year for 40 years or something like that. These these state bonds, in some cases, become valueless because the states can't pay them off. Good morning. And so what Duer does is, because he is assistant. Yes, he was probably the first millionaire in the United States. And what he does is he knows that the U.S. Treasury is going to announce that it's going to buy up the state bonds and reissue them to borrowers, or to lenders rather, in the Netherlands and in Britain and in France, in Germany. And he knows that the U.S. government is going to buy up the state bonds, and sort of a week beforehand, he buys up Virginia bonds at 10 cents on the dollar. And then when when the U.S. Treasury accepts the debts of the state, once the Constitution is passed, then Duer makes a fortune. So he pays 10 cents on the dollar for these bonds, and then he ends up selling them to the Treasury Department, who are going to pay off those bonds. And basically pays himself, if that makes sense, because he's assistant to the Treasury Secretary, assistant to Hamilton. He is going to pay himself off. Hamilton argues that there ought to be a first bank of the United States. Right? Insider trading, exactly. That's precisely what's going on, is that Duer sends out a ship in Virginia along the James and the York River, and the ship stops at every major plantation and buys up the Virginia bonds weeks before anyone knows that all these bonds are going to be paid off in full by the federal government. Okay, Alexander Hamilton proposes a first bank of the United States. And remember, we talked before about the financial revolution in Great Britain. Starting in 1689, 1690, the Bank of England is created in 1693, which allows the British government to issue debt, to borrow heavily, to increase the value of increase the number of ships at sea, and accumulate deficits, which it will pay off over time. Hamilton basically says that the United States should have the same system. That its debts should be paid off gradually over time, and that a Bank of the United States with offices in each of the states and offices in Amsterdam, London, and Frankfurt will take loans from people to pay off this debt long term. Is that clear? Okay. So he proposes the first Bank of the United States. And after he proposes the first Bank of the United States, he has stock to issue in the Bank of the United States. You could buy stock in the Bank of the United States. The stock in the Bank of the United States, it turns out that Hamilton offers it at a discount to members of Congress. Thomas Jefferson finds out that in the first term, almost half of the Congress gets preferential access to stock in the Bank of the United States. They get to buy it when no one else has access to it, and they get to buy it at a discount. This is the beginning of the war, really, between Thomas Jefferson on the one hand and Alexander Hamilton on the other. Congress Hall in Philadelphia, it's Hamilton that goes to individual members of Congress and gives them access to these stocks. Yeah, not Robin Hood in the old sense, not robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, but Robin Hood in the new sense about maybe a private institution that can trade on other people's investments. So this is it's at Congress Hall that Alexander Hamilton basically, according to Jefferson, buys off Congress. Right? That's exactly the problem. So we're talking about corruption, and this is as what Thomas Jefferson says is the Bank of the United States is, quote, a machine for the corruption of the legislature. Right? It may be perfectly sensible to take all the state debt and turn it into federal debt and get lenders in Amsterdam and London and in Frankfurt to buy American debt and get paid off over time. That may be perfectly sensible, but Hamilton's way of doing it, by basically giving preferential shares in the stock to members of Congress, is totally unacceptable. That's what Jefferson argues. Hamilton argues that it wouldn't have been, well, he's not very explicit about this, but I think Hamilton would argue that it wouldn't have been passed otherwise, that the financial revolution wouldn't have taken place if he hadn't done this. Now, this is not just happening in the United States. This is also happening in France. This is also happening in Russia. That all three, France, Russia, and the United States, at all around the same time, right around the 1760s and 1770s, are engaging in this financial revolution, right? This financial revolution themselves. Britain did it in 1690. France, Russia, and the United States are all going to do it between 1760 and 1762 and 1791. Roughly in that period, about those 30 years, all three governments, France, Russia, and the United States, will create a system that will create a bank. The bank will issue currency. The bank will take the national debt and distribute it around to people who are potentially lenders. This is going to cause chaos in France. It's going to cause Russia to be able to expand very rapidly, and it's going to cause political conflict and a two-party system in the United States. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about banking, because when we talk about the Bank of the United States, it's not entirely obvious what a bank does. And what a bank does in the 1770s is a little bit different from what a bank does now. And so I want to give us, have us think about what that is, or try to understand what a bank is in the present. And I say this in part because, in fact, most bankers now don't really understand what a bank in the 1770s and 1780s does. So there are all these sort of assumptions about how banks work, but I want to give us a little bit more grounded sense of what this Bank of the United States does. So let's take a look at this cartoon, because I think the cartoon will give us a sense of what's going on here. This is, so what's going on in this image? Who's here? Okay, so this is the Bank of the United States. 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 This is the Bank of the United Sta it says at the bottom, oh, you can't see it, banknotes, paper money, French alarmists, oh the devil, ah, poor John Bull. So this is John Bull, who's at the center. And what is John Bull being persuaded? Can you guys read what it's saying? It says, don't take his damned paper, John. Insist upon having gold to make your peace with the French when they come. Yeah, okay, they're making fun of certain people. I will take it. Oh, may as well. Let my master Billy hold the gold to keep away you Frenchmen, as save it to gie at you when ye come over with your damned invasion. So this is this event is 1793 when France is considering invading Great Britain. Okay, so that's John Bull at the center, right? Yes, this is in fact a British artist. So this is not this is basic. So sorry, this is not in the United States. This is in Great Britain. Sorry, I didn't mean to confuse you. So this person in the middle is a London is basically supposed to represent Britain. The person on the left is the Bank of England, represents the Bank of England. The person on the right is a Frenchman who's trying to persuade this British person not to accept gold, but to accept notes. So the USA is not in this picture at all. This is basically all happening in Great Britain. The person on the right is an agent of the French. Okay. So they're making fun of him, and he is willing to accept notes instead of gold. Okay, that's the joke, is that he's willing to accept notes instead of gold, and the banker is hiding the gold underneath his counter, right? So the banker on the left, who represents the Bank of England, is holding gold in the vault, but he doesn't want to give people gold, he wants to give them notes, right? Promises to pay in the future. He's shoveling them across to this British say merchant or somebody like that who is dumb enough to accept British notes instead of gold. Okay, what a bank does from this, well, through time, but all the way up until the all the way up until the 18 and 1900s, what a bank does is it takes gold and it holds gold and silver as reserves. Okay, at the bottom there. So it keeps gold and silver, and so this is why every rob a bank movie involves people breaking into the vault and taking all the gold. Most banks don't have gold anymore, but there was a time for 1,000 years in which banks held gold in their vaults. And if you went into the bank and you had a banknote from that bank, you were entitled to the gold and silver. So if you had a pound note, you could take it into the Bank of England, hand over a Bank of England pound note, and get that much in gold or silver. You could demand it. Why would you take a note instead of gold? Why might you take a note instead of gold? If you're a merchant or a farmer, yeah, the pound sterling, right? So it was a pound sterling was basically it was the value of it was the fact that the bank would always pay for this. Okay, good. It's not easy, right? It's easier to carry, and it's not easy to store gold. And you walk away from a bank with a handful of gold, and right, you can be robbed, easily robbed. So people aren't going to steal it. Exactly. These banknotes have numbers on them, right? And so if you look at go into your wallet and pull out a dollar bill or a $10 bill or something like that, you'll see that there's a number on that banknote. There's always numbers on banknotes. And if that banknote was stolen, you could advertise in the newspaper and say my $10 bill was stolen. It has number 117 on the front. If anyone finds it, it's mine. And so if someone tries to then turn in that $10 note to buy something, they could be arrested. right? So the currency was it wasn't exactly theft proof, but it was a little bit safer, a little bit more convenient. You could send a note in the mail, or you could send a bunch of notes in the mail, and it would be safer than carrying gold from place to place or silver from place to place, much lighter. Yeah, it's essentially an IOU from the bank. No, I've seen them in newspapers, and it's pretty clear. I was knocked over. I've seen them in newspapers even in the 1820s and 1830s in New Orleans, and people say, I was beaten by robbers, and they took my 10 banknotes, and these are the numbers of them. So I don't think they were that often faked, and there weren't that many of them you saw. But yeah, it's essentially an IOU from the bank. The bank is saying this is worth £10 sterling. It will be you bring in that note, and we'll give you gold. The bank doesn't like to do that. It doesn't like to turn over all of its gold. It wants to hold on to the gold. Okay. Now, that's one part of the bank, is it's issuing these IOUs, which are basically currency, which are basically notes. They have the name of the bank on them, and you can use them. Even in Britain today, if you have a banknote and you look at a banknote, the pound banknote, it doesn't just say Bank of it. It says the name of the bank that's actually issued the currency. We have U.S. Treasury certificates, but in Britain, banks still print currency, and it's got the name of the bank on them. Hong Kong banks are similar in that sense. Okay, so there's gold here at the bottom, and there's the notes that are issued. Now, how does a bank make money? How does the bank make its money? Well, what it does is it issues more credit. It issues more notes than it has gold, right? And it also makes interest. Excellent. So I want to talk about those two things. First of all, a bank has what's called a reserve requirement. So a bank will have to have, say, 20% silver or gold, or 50% silver or gold underneath its table for every note that it issues. So it can issue, say, $10,000 worth of notes, but it has to have $5,000 worth of gold under its table. Does that make sense? Okay. That reserve requirement means that the bank can issue more notes than it has, and as a result, it basically has more credit than it has gold underneath its table. But the other thing it's doing is borrowing money from other people, right? So it's people are. Let's see, how precisely is this working? So basically what a bank is doing is issuing credit to other people. And let me just talk a little bit about how that works. Let me just show you briefly how this happens. So every bank has to have borrowers and lenders. And this is the United States scenario. The borrowers, in the case of the Bank of the United States, are going to be American merchants and the U.S. government. And they're going to borrow at something like 7 to 10% interest. Okay, so these people are going to borrow from the bank. They're going to be issued currency. They're going to use that currency to, launch ships into Western waters and engage in trade. The U.S. government is going to use that to fund wars, or to build internal improvements, roads and things like that. It's going to pay them off over time, and it's going to borrow from the Bank of the United States at something like 7 to 10% interest. At the same time, the bank is going to lend to other, it's going to borrow from French aristocrats, English merchants, or Dutch aristocrats, people who are going to effectively accept a loan, buy a bond from the Bank of the United States, and get paid off over time, just like the exchequer bills and things like that we talked about before. They're going to say, I'll buy $100 in Bank of the United States bonds, and I'll be paid off $10 a year over the next 11 years, or something like that, right? And so the bank is simultaneously lending to these people over here, the merchants and the government, and it's borrowing from people over here, like the merchants, the Dutch aristocrats, French aristocrats, and elsewhere. Mostly the Bank of the United States is borrowing in Europe and lending in the United States. There's other ways in which the bank makes money, and that is that basically American farmers and tradesmen and others will hold the currency of the United States instead of gold, and they don't collect any interest, but the bank can issue more currency than it has gold, and so that's another way that the bank makes money. So the combination of being able to issue currency for the gold, for a relatively small amount of gold that it holds in its vault, and to connect borrowers who borrow at 7 to 10% with lenders who get 5%, that means they make the difference between those two, right? So if you imagine, so Parker, for example, and Caitlin, and I'm going to just use people's, and Sophia. So Sophia is going to be the banker here. Sophia is going to lend, is going to borrow from Caitlin at 5%, and Caitlin is going to get a 5% return. She's going to use that money that she borrows from Caitlin to lend to Parker, but lend to Parker at 10%. The difference between the 5% and the 10% is a tremendous amount of money, which is going to support the Bank of the United States and other banks like this. So this is why people want to run banks, is these two things. Basically, the reserve requirement, being able to hold a certain amount of gold but issue much more currency, and to connect borrowers and lenders. Does that make sense? So you can see why the United States would need a bank, because the United States has a lot of debts for this war that it has to pay off, and it doesn't want to pay a huge interest rate. It wants an institution that's got those connections, both abroad and nationally. It's going to want an institution that will issue the U.S. Debt, but will also lend the U.S. money when the U.S. needs money. So the U.S. is going to issue bonds, but it's also going to borrow on a short term from the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States, on the other hand, is going to lend its money. Is going to borrow from these lenders here on the other side. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the Bank of the United States. It's a good idea. Hamilton's what allowed the financial revolution allowed Great Britain to become a national power. It's a British kind of institution that Hamilton thinks is a good idea. Unfortunately, the way he goes about it, the way he goes about getting this institution passed, is by effectively bribing Congress to get it passed. This is one of the kind of ugly secrets of the Bank of the United States, is that almost half of Congress is bribed to create the first bank. Okay, does that make sense? The people who are upset about this, in particular, are Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Jefferson is upset because he doesn't much like Hamilton, but he's very upset about this corruption of the legislature. He thinks that this Bank of the United States is going to become a powerful political institution. Effectively, the wealth that this institution generates is going to create a party system. It's an opportunity for corruption. And so Madison, who had been friends with Hamilton, Jefferson and Madison, both Virginians, get together and they decide that they're going to create a new party to oppose Hamilton, to oppose the Bank of the United States. And they go on what is called a Botanizing Excursion in 1791, shortly after the Bank of the United States is created. They go up to New York, they visit the Hudson River Valley, and they meet with this guy on the right, Chancellor Livingston. Chancellor Livingston has his own problems with Hamilton. Hamilton has become a very powerful person in New York City with he's in a sort of New York faction that Chancellor Livingston doesn't like. Chancellor Livingston is a very large landowner in upstate New York, and Hamilton has been talking about basically preventing the Livingstons from having as much control as they do in the Mohawk Valley. It's complicated how Livingston does this, but basically Livingston and other Dutch families like him have perpetual rights to land along the Mohawk River and the Hudson River, and they in fact can't sell land. The land is perpetually theirs, and other people effectively rent the land from Livingston and others. Hamilton has generated a kind of controversy about Livingston, and so Jefferson and Madison meet up with Livingston, and together they say what they're going to do is look around for plants in upstate New York, try to figure out what is killing the Hessian fly, which is killing a lot of wheat plants in Virginia and Maryland. They're interested in trying to figure out why that is, so they meet up with Livingston. But in fact, what they're going to do on this botanizing excursion is create the first party, the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans are going to be a party that's going to be arrayed against Hamilton, arrayed against the Bank of the United States. Now, who was it that suggested that there's they see a depression on the way in? Sorry, scrolling up through the comments here. I think it was Emily. Oh, Sophia. Okay, yeah. So, sorry, Sophia said this. Yeah, that this is going to lead to a financial panic and a breakdown. But before we do this, I'd like us to consider this for a second. We have Jefferson and Madison. They've created a right? Sort of. Yeah. Jefferson basically says there's already a party created. It's called the Federalist Party. The Federalists, there were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Yeah, it makes your head hurt, right? But Jefferson was scared that the bank was going to lead to parties, and so he makes the first party, which is the Democratic Republicans. It's the first opposition party, I suppose, opposition to the Federalists. So they go to New York because the first party is basically a what's the word? It's an allegiance between a group of large planters in Virginia, like Jefferson and Madison, and large landholders in New York, which is Chancellor Livingston. This allegiance, this alliance between these two groups is going to create what's called the Democratic Party, or the Democratic Republicans. Okay, but before we do this, let's go back. Okay, let's go back a second to the Constitution. So the Constitution has passed. 1789. It's been passed by all the states. The Anti-Federalists have lost, and the Anti-Federalists have basically given in. They've either been outvoted or they've decided to switch parties and join the Federalists because the Bill of Rights is passed. But let's imagine that this Constitution doesn't happen. Let's just step back a little bit to say 1789. Let's imagine that the Anti-Federalists, even though they get the Bill of Rights, are still powerful, they're still critical, and the Constitution doesn't pass. So let's imagine an environment in which the Constitution doesn't pass. In that environment, if you imagine the kind of revolutionary legislature, the articles, the members of the Continental Congress getting together and discovering who Publius is. Discovering that Publius consists of John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. With what we know about what happens in 1791 and 1792, I'd like now us to try to put Madison on trial. Imagine it's 1792. The Constitution has not passed. James Madison has escaped and crossed into Canada. He's finally been captured by a revolutionary brigade and brought back to Philadelphia to be tried for crimes. You are the members of the Revolutionary Tribunal. What shall we do with Madison? The Constitution has failed. No. But had the Constitution, there were people who were talking about hanging John Jay, people were talking about hanging Alexander Hamilton. Madison, no. But people did almost hang John Jay and Alexander Hamilton. There were people talking very seriously about it at the time of the Constitution. Right. Okay, 58% said leave him be. 27% said tar, feather, and expel. 8% said guillotine, and 2%, another 8%, two of you said question the tribunal. Okay. All right. So, yes, what happens in many revolutions, and it doesn't happen in the American Revolution, but it happens in many. It happens in the French Revolution. It happens in the Revolution in China. It happens in the Revolution in Russia. It happens in many revolutions. Is that the revolution sort of gets out of hand, and the people who argue against the revolution, people who push for a sort of stability and a new framework that limits the extent of the revolution, do get the guillotine, do get assassinated. So this happens with in the French Revolution, it happens in the Russian Revolution, it happens in the Chinese Revolution, it happens in many revolutions, that this sort of revolutionary spirit, which I talked about last class, can sort of spiral, and the attempts to sort of beat back the revolution, and the Constitution is certainly an attempt to beat back in some ways the revolution, to maintain parts of it, but to beat back others, is sometimes isn't successful, and what we see is revolutionary violence and tribunals and death. So it's one of the things that's worth thinking about here is that the U.S. was, I would argue, relatively close to John Jay, who becomes a Supreme Court justice, says after he gets the Jay Treaty passed that he could have seen the lights. There were lights enough burning him in effigy from Maine to Georgia. What was the expression, that they could have navigated from Maine to Georgia just by the lights of the effigies that were burned on his behalf. Hamilton also likewise viewed as being a royalist, viewed as being someone who's trying to take back bring the U.S. back to a British system. Madison ultimately defects from this crew, the Federalists, but if the revolution had gone another way, it's quite possible that these people would have been would have ended. Okay. Does that make sense? The threat, as many people at the time saw it, is that the Constitution would be a step backwards. When the Bank of the United States is formed, both Jefferson and Madison feel like all their fears, all the anxieties by the Anti-Federalists turned out to be true. That in fact, Hamilton and others were creating a kind of aristocracy based in the Bank of the United States, one that threatened liberty, threatened democracy, that this was a corrupt faction that would actually control the federal government. Okay. So, in April of 1792, Dewar, who is the assistant secretary to Hamilton, tries to buy up all the 6% bonds of the Bank of the United States to force the U.S. Stockholders to pay a premium for him for the U.S. bank stock. So basically the way it worked is that you could buy bank stock in the Bank of the United States, but then you had to buy, you could pay for it either with cash, which not a lot of people had, or with bonds. Dewar figures this out, and just like he did in 1791, before it becomes clear how this is going to operate, Dewar tries to buy up all of the U.S. bonds that are on the market in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, all at the same time, right around April of 1792. Chancellor Livingston, who's in the Democratic Republicans, gets wind of this, and he persuades his friends to withdraw all their money from New York banks. What this does is put the New York banks in trouble. And the New York banks face a gold shortage because people are withdrawing their gold from the bank here, right? So when the people withdraw their gold from the bank, what is the bank forced to do? It's forced to call in its notes, it's supposed to pay off its notes, and stop lending to people. It stops lending to someone like William Dewar. And so William Dewar gets caught trying to buy up all the bonds in the United States in this sort of clever attempt to control the stock in the Bank of the United States. And it leads to what's called the Dewar Panic, the first financial panic in the United States. It's on the same time that, to raise revenue, Hamilton begins taxing whiskey. And it's also in 1792 that we see the sugar revolt and the whiskey rebellion, as people oppose having to pay these new taxes to support the government. The whiskey rebels are mostly based in Pittsburgh in western Pennsylvania, and they oppose a new tax that's imposed on whiskey, an excise tax. They say that this excise tax is just like the stamp tax. It's just like the other excise taxes that Britain had supported, and so they oppose Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton organizes a military force, marches to western Pennsylvania, and puts down the Whiskey Rebellion. Things look bad in 1793. In April of July, the Dewar Panic in 1793, people blame Dewar for it, and they blame Hamilton for it. But it leads to, when Chancellor Livingston persuades lots of people to withdraw their money from the Bank of New York, he does it to defeat Hamilton. But what it actually does is lead to a depression throughout the United States between April and July of 1792. The one thing that saved the United States from chaos is that the revolution appears in France, starting in 1789, which gradually spirals out of control by July of 1793. Well, out of control, depending on which side you're on. But the king is assassinated, killed on the guillotine. Many of the people who supported the revolution are themselves, the sans-culottes, are themselves killed by revolutionary tribunals in France. Luckily for the United States, the terror that begins in France when people start cutting off the heads of lords and aristocrats and also people who aren't sufficiently revolutionary in the French Revolution, the price of the United States bank stock goes up again, as many French aristocrats start to buy up stock in the Bank of the United States because the United States seems safer than France. Likewise, in Amsterdam, the Bank of the United States stock, which had plummeted because of the Dewar Panic, starts to climb back up again because the one safe place in the Americas and Europe seems to be the United States. It's around this time that we're going to see these revolutionary assemblies and the terror create a revolutionary army, which is going to march across Europe. So we need to put this context in this sort of understand the sort of international context of this conflict, that there's a Dewar Panic that happens in 1793. Many people blame Hamilton for this, and Dewar is arrested ultimately for his debt. He's in prison at the same time. There's a depression in the United States in 1792. The recovery comes a year later, only because things are worse in France. Does that make sense? Yeah, Dewar does end up in jail, basically. And he stays in jail for a number of years. His kids do okay, but he's jailed for debts. This is at a time you could be jailed for your debts. Now we can't, right? If we have debts, we're not jailed for them. But in the 1700s, all the way up until around the 1830s in the U.S., you could be jailed if you had debts that you didn't pay. Okay, so this is the party then that Hamilton and that Jefferson and Madison have created with Chancellor Livingston. This new party called the Democratic Party, or also called the Democratic Republican Party. It's a funny term, right? Just confusing because we're used to Democrats and Republicans being on different parties. They call themselves the Republican Party, but the people like Hamilton and others called them the Democratic Party. Democrat was a sort of curse word in the 1780s and 1790s, in part because of the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution was increasingly seen as democracy out of control. This split between the Democratic Republicans on the one hand and the Federalists on the other is going to sort of give the lie to Federalist 10. Federalist 10, the plan was that if one party emerged, that if one group of corruptionists got together, this would ultimately be beaten back. Whether that's true or not, it's clear that rather than seeing multiple corruptionist groups, what we see is two concrete parties emerge: one that supports the Bank of the United States, and one that opposes it. The one that supports the Bank of the United States is the Federalist Party. The new party that opposes it are the Democratic Republicans. By 1800, what's called the Revolution of 1800, Thomas Jefferson defeats the Federalist Party, emerges as the new president, and the Democratic Republicans emerge in Congress. One of the first things that Jefferson wants to do is to close down the Bank of the United States. He's not going to be successful. There are going to be enough people in Congress that are going to block his attempts to end the Bank of the United States. And the Bank of the United States is going to continue all the way up until 1811. Is that clear? Okay, meanwhile in France, what we see is Napoleon Bonaparte come to power. Initially, a member of a sort of artillery brigade, a head of an artillery brigade in the French army. The French army ultimately takes control in France. At the head of the French army, Napoleon begins a war against the rest of Europe. The Napoleonic Wars go on from 1803 to 1815. So during Jefferson's presidency, Napoleon is sweeping across Europe, ending monarchies and in Germany, or what we now call Germany, in Switzerland, in the Netherlands. All these other places are being there's this tremendous revolutionary violence as Napoleon is sweeping across Europe. This is another thing that helps the federal government, the U.S. government at the time, because the U.S. is in a position to provide food for both armies, both the armies of Napoleon and the armies of Great Britain. Napoleon opposes something called the Continental. What's it called? The Continental Plan? Yes, the Continental Plan, I think, which is basically an attempt to block Britain from using any port in Europe. Britain issues orders in council that attempt to block France from using any port being landing in any port that Britain controls. And so basically, each of them is trying to prevent the other from having access to grain. Luckily, the United States is in a position to supply grain to both sides. Right. Excellent. So it's in this point that Jefferson, as president, says our object is to feed and theirs to fight. If we're not forced by England, we shall have a gainful time of it. We only have to pray that their soldiers may eat a great deal. And in fact, the U.S. becomes the provisioner for both the French and the English in the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815. What pulls the U.S.'s kind of butt out of the fire after the 1793 panic is that there's even worse conflict in Europe. All right. Okay. So to answer the question that we started with, Federalist 10, did it work? Maybe. We do get a two-party system, and that's the system that we're stuck with basically for the rest of, all the way until today, is a two-party system. One with ties, this first-party system has one with ties to the Bank of the United States, the Federalists, and another that's opposed to it, the Democratic Republicans. That two-party system is going to define the U.S. Starting in 1791 all the way through until the present day. Are there questions?